Tonight, we're opening the creaking door to a quieter, often forgotten side of medieval life, the childhood years. Far from the stories of knights and queens, this is about the small, tired hands that fed the animals, swept the floors, and tried to stay quiet when the grown-ups spoke. Medieval children weren't cuddled to safety. They were raised with discipline, duty, and expectations that often arrived far too early. But before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy these slower, thoughtful walks through the past. And if you feel like it, leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's quietly wonderful to know who's out there, winding down with history. Now, dim the lights. Let the day fall away. Get comfortable, and let us begin. Not in castles or courts, but in a cottage. A single room, a low ceiling, the sound of chickens outside, and inside, the cry of a newborn child, swaddled in linen that smells faintly of the hearth. In the medieval world, a child's first breath was taken not in a sterile room, but beside the familiar crackle of home. A midwife's hands, steady and practiced, guided the way. There was no soft music or pastel balloons, only the rustle of rushes underfoot, the chant of prayer whispered over damp cloth, and the eyes of siblings peeking from behind cloaks in the shadows. Birth was sacred, yes, but it was also dangerous. Many women did not survive it. Many babies did not wake for a second dawn. And so every cry, every heartbeat, every tiny fist curled against the cold was greeted with quiet awe and a quick blessing. If a child lived past the first days, their life began in earnest. But there was little time to simply be a baby. Life moved quickly. By the age of 3 or 4, even the smallest children were expected to carry water, gather herbs, watch younger siblings, or scatter feed for the animals. Play was not forbidden, but it was something squeezed between chores, like sunshine between clouds. Toys, if they existed, were made of wood, cloth, bone. A carved sheep, a rag doll. A hoop rolled through the mud, and laughter. Yes, laughter, ringing out through crooked lanes and thatched hamlets, soft as bells on the wind. But beneath it all was an understanding. You are small, yes, but not forever. And the world does not wait. Discipline came early. A scold, a smack, a switch from the hedgerow. All were familiar to young shoulders. Not out of cruelty always, but out of necessity. A child who wandered too far might fall into the river. A child who left the gate open might lose the family's only pig. Correction was swift. Tears were common. But comfort, too, was never far behind. A lap, a song, a hunk of warm bread. Children grew not alone, but among many. Cousins, neighbors, traveling friars, weary peddlers, all were part of the child's world. They listened, watched, learned. They mimicked the way their mother ground oats, the way their father bound twine, the way the village priest traced the sign of the cross. Childhood, you see, was not a separate kingdom. It was a passage, short, uncertain, tender, and each child moved through it like a candle in the wind. Some blew out early, Others flickered fiercely, but all were shaped by the rhythm of the day, the will of the seasons, and the weight of expectation. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think of those small feet padding across cold floors, of lullabies sung in old tongues, of discipline met with forgiveness, of little hands holding crusts of bread or tiny slates scratched with charcoal. The world was not kind, but it was theirs, and for a time they were children in it. Sleep now, dear one. The night is long, and we have much more to see. Born to work, born to obey. In the quiet corners of the medieval world, a child was not simply born. They were shaped, carved like wood by the slow, unyielding pressure of duty. There were no gap years, no concept of adolescence as we know it, no long and lazy childhoods. From the moment a child could stand steady on their own 2 feet, they were expected to serve their family, their home, their faith. And so, dear listener, imagine now a little girl, 5 winters old, her hands pink from the cold water of the stream where she washes turnips, her woolen sleeves heavy with damp. Or a boy, not much older, with his fist wrapped tight around a stick as he drives geese through the muddy lane, trying not to trip on the uneven stones beneath. They are not playing. They are learning the rhythm of survival. Children were, above all, necessary. Another pair of hands, another back to bear the weight of life's endless tasks. In the fields, they chased crows from crops. In the cottage, they helped knead bread and mend nets. In winter, they gathered firewood. In summer, they turned hay. There was pride in usefulness. And love, though rarely spoken aloud, was shown in trust. A mother handing her son a pail and sending him into the forest. A father teaching his daughter how to bind a wound or milk a goat. And through all this, there was discipline. Always discipline. Not the gentle reasoning of modern parenting books, but the stern instruction of a world with little room for error. Obedience was survival. Children were expected to listen, to remember, to do as they were told. And when they didn't, well, then came the rod, or the belt, or a sharply spoken verse of scripture. Spare the rod, spoil the child, they said. And they believed it. But it was not always anger. Often, it was fear. Fear that a child might step beyond the bounds of safety and never return. That disobedience would lead not to inconvenience, but to death. The well was deep, the fire was hot, the forest was dark. Lessons were harsh because life was harsher. Yet within these bounds, there were moments of gentleness. A mother braiding her child's hair by candlelight. A father showing his son how to whittle a toy from a scrap of oak. Stories whispered beneath quilts made of old wool and worn dreams. Comfort was not found in abundance, but in presence. The closeness of others, the soft weight of a sibling beside you in bed, the hush of shared breathing in the dark. Childhood was crowded, not just with people, but with expectations. And yet, it was also, strangely, free. There were no report cards, no exams, no clock to punch or screen to obey. Learning came from watching, from listening, from doing what needed to be done. And so a child might grow wise, in ways we would now call old-fashioned, knowing the weather by the smell of the wind, or the health of a sheep by the shine of its eye. They learned patience, too, how to wait through hunger, how to endure boredom, how to carry sadness quietly. There were no therapists, no safe spaces, no timeouts. Only the world, wide and cold and waiting. And still, they laughed. They played when they could. Tag through the village green. Hide and seek among the haystacks. Stones flicked into the river. Riddles told and retold. Even in a life filled with labor, children found ways to make the day softer. For childhood is stubborn. It pushes through like grass between paving stones. And though the world of the medieval child was strict and often silent, it was not without joy. It was not without dreams. So as you drift off tonight, think of those tiny hands, raw from work, but strong already. Think of the sharp voice of a parent, not cruel, but urgent, and the quiet smile that followed when the task was done. They were born to work, yes, born to obey, but also born to live. And live they did, beneath cold stars and low ceilings, in fields and kitchens and abbey halls. They grew, fast, small, brave. Let us follow them a little further. There is much yet to see. Swaddling, naming, and first steps. Let us now slip back even earlier in a child's life, to the very first hours, when the world was still new and strange, and the warmth of the womb had just been traded for the smoke of the hearth and the rough hush of a medieval home. A baby born in these times entered a world that watched closely, that listened for its first cry, not just with joy, but with relief. For silence was feared, and death was always too near. Birth was no gentle ceremony. It was sacred and risky, hopeful and grim. Once the child was wiped clean and bundled tight, it was immediately swaddled, wrapped in cloth from shoulders to feet, arms pinned straight at the sides, legs bound close together like a little wooden figure. This practice was not seen as cruel, but necessary. People believed swaddling kept the child's limbs straight, helped them grow properly, prevented injury, and above all, kept them quiet and still in homes where there was no room or time for restless infants. A swaddled child might be hung from a peg in their cradle, or laid in a drawer, or placed near the fire where the warmth could soak into their wrappings. And there they would stay, only occasionally unwrapped, only gently handled. Even love in those early days had to be practical. Naming was next. For a child to have a name was no small thing. In a world where illness and accident claimed the young with cruel frequency, a name was a stake driven into the soil of life, a declaration. This child is here. This child matters. Many were named after saints or biblical figures, especially those whose feast days fell near the child's birth. Names were protection, a kind of spoken prayer. To name a child was to hope, fiercely, perhaps foolishly. Baptism followed soon after, sometimes within hours. The church taught that to die unbaptized was to be lost forever, and so parents rushed to the priest, even in the dead of night, even in storms. A tiny baby, still red and wrinkled from birth, would be carried to the font, sprinkled with holy water, anointed with oil. The ritual was swift but solemn, and for many, the only ceremony in their life where they were held with such sacred care. And then, life began. Slowly, unevenly. First smiles, first cries, first illnesses. The medieval world had no pediatricians, no thermometers, no baby books filled with milestones. A fever was feared. A cough could be a death sentence. And yet, somehow, children grew, crawled, stood, took first steps across dirt floors, across rushes, toward the open arms of a mother busy grinding grain, or a father returning from the field. These moments were not always recorded. There were no photographs, no journals, but they were remembered, tucked into the minds of weary parents who carried so many burdens yet found room for joy. First steps were often barefoot, in rooms without carpets, on floors swept but never clean. First words were not cheered with videos, but marked with smiles, small nods, and sometimes a quiet prayer of thanks. There were lullabies, too, if you listened carefully. Sung in dialects long forgotten, melodies passed down by voice alone. They were not grand, just fragments of hymns, scraps of rhymes, stories tucked into song. But they soothed. A child cried less when they heard a familiar tune, when they were rocked by firelight, when the world slowed just enough for someone to hum. And so, even in that rugged world, rough blankets and smoky walls, infancy held beauty. Not the clean, bright beauty of our age, but the simple kind, the kind found in touch, in warmth, in whispered names and shared breath. If a child lived past their first year, they were strong. If they lived past 5, they were likely to grow old. And so childhood began with endurance, with surviving the fragility of early life. And those who did were soon drawn into the rhythm of work, worship, and the long path to becoming useful. But still, for those earliest years, there was tenderness, there was awe, there was hope, cradled close against the chest, swaddled in linen, named and blessed beneath a ceiling of beams and smoke. And tonight, as you drift further into rest, think of those first steps taken in silence, of the weight of a name whispered into holy water, of small fingers curling around a parent's thumb. These were the first echoes of a medieval childhood, quiet, cautious, but alive. Let us go on. Their journey has only just begun. Toys, games, and the small joys of childhood. Though the world of the medieval child was often cold, hungry, and full of work, it was not without joy. For even in the shadow of hardship, children have always found ways to play. They are, after all, masters of invention. And in the dirt paths between cottages, beneath the trees at the village edge, and even in the narrow alleys of crowded towns, the small echoes of laughter still rang out. There were no toy shops, of course. No shelves lined with plush animals or blinking lights. But that did not mean there were no toys. A piece of wood became a knight's sword. A bundle of rags, a beloved doll. Children carved animals from bone or wood, fashioned hoops from old barrels, and tied sticks together to build tiny carts or houses in the mud. In towns, cobblers sometimes gave scraps of leather to children, who turned them into little whips or straps for games. A worn cloth might become a sling, a feather, a hat. Toys were not bought. They were imagined, crafted in spare moments from spare materials, and perhaps that made them all the more treasured. Games, too, were everywhere. Children played tag, hide and seek, blind man's bluff. They threw stones at marks on walls, balanced on fences, or raced barefoot across uneven fields. In winter, they slid across frozen ponds on bones tied to their feet, laughing through chattering teeth. Even the church, with all its rules and watchfulness, could not smother the playfulness of children. Though certain games were frowned upon, especially those deemed too rowdy or irreverent, most villagers accepted that children would find their fun, even when no one gave them permission. And play was not just for fun. It was learning. It was a way to explore roles, to copy the adults around them, to practice strength and courage in pretend battles, or gentleness with dolls wrapped in old scraps. A girl might pretend to stir a pot with a twig, mimicking her mother. A boy might lead a line of imaginary oxen with a firm voice, just like his father. And sometimes, in the soft light of dusk, when chores were done and the world was briefly quiet, families watched their children play with a kind of tired fondness. They did not speak of quality time, but they noticed. They smiled, and for a moment, the burden of the day felt lighter. There were festivals, too. Feast days, saints' days, village gatherings. On these rare occasions, children were allowed a little more freedom to eat sweetened bread, to dance, to watch traveling performers or jesters. The colors, the music, the stories told in open squares or beside fire pits filled their minds with wonder. These were the moments that stayed with them. The day the bear came through the village, led by a tattered chain. The evening when a wandering musician played a song so sad it made someone's mother cry. These were the fragments of beauty they carried with them, even into adulthood. Yet joy was always held close beside sorrow. A favorite toy lost in a storm. A game interrupted by a shout to fetch water. A sibling too young to play, wrapped instead in swaddling and sleeping beside the hearth. Childhood was fleeting. Innocence, even more so. The world pulled children into its seriousness quickly, sometimes too quickly. But before that pull became too strong, there was laughter. There was mischief. There were daisy chains strung on little wrists and sticks drawn like swords at dusk. So tonight, as your room grows still and the hum of sleep draws near, picture them, the children who once played in fields where now only trees grow. Hear the faint echoes of their games in the wind, the clatter of stones, the squeals of pretend fear, the bursts of real delight. Picture their toys, humble but beloved, their bare feet quick and sure, their imaginations fierce and bright against the gray of daily life. Even in a world that asked so much of them, they found time to be children, and that, in itself, was a quiet kind of victory. Sleep now, dear listener. The games have ended for today, but there are more stories to come. Learning by watching, remembering by doing. In the medieval world, there were no classrooms for most children, no chalkboards or exams, no backpacks filled with parchment and ink. And yet, learning was everywhere. It seeped into the fabric of each day like the scent of smoke into wool. From the moment they could walk, children were apprenticed to life. Their lessons written not in books, but in gestures, habits, repetitions. A little girl learned how to knead dough, not by being told, but by standing at her mother's elbow, watching the way the flour clouded the air, and the dough grew smooth under her mother's palms. A little boy learned to swing an axe, not from a teacher, but from the way his father adjusted his grip, how he checked the grain of the wood before raising the blade. Every task, every moment, held a lesson. They learned which herbs soothed a burn, which mushrooms brought sickness. They learned how to spot a ripening ear of barley, how to hear the change in the wind. They memorized hymns not by reading them, but by hearing them repeated, sung in the same cold chapel week after week. Memory was survival. You could not afford to forget how to light a fire, or tie a snare, or whisper the right prayer when fever came. Forgetting could mean hunger. Forgetting could mean death. But the mind of a child, as ever, is quick and hungry. And so they learned, absorbed, repeated, mimicked, not always with understanding, not at first, but with precision. There were no gold stars, no praise beyond a brief, well done, if that. But there was the satisfaction of getting it right, of being trusted to carry the water without spilling it, or to tend the fire alone. And there were other lessons, quieter ones. How to speak in front of the Lord's steward without offense. How to keep your eyes lowered when walking past the priest. How to step aside when your elders argued, and how to disappear when your parents wept. Social knowledge, unspoken rules about power, class, behavior, these too were learned early. Because childhood may have been tender, but the world around it was not. A child might know within their first few years that they were not noble, that they were not free, that they belonged to a certain tier of the world and would likely remain there. A peasant's child saw few examples of escape. There were no dreams of university, unless you were born to the cloth or the coin. For most, the path ahead was well worn. You would work as your parents did, marry as they had, age in the same room where you were born. And yet, within that path, there was dignity, there was purpose. Learning was a right of belonging. To know how to thatch a roof, or plow a furrow, or twist flax into thread, was to be part of the world, to contribute to the weaving of daily life. Children learn this not in stages, but all at once. 1 year they were carried, the next they carried others. 1 month they were watching, the next they were doing. Time did not wait. Childhood was a bridge, not a destination. And for most, that bridge was crossed quickly. Yet within those brief years, a great deal was absorbed. Things that no parchment could hold. Things that lived in the hands, the tongue, the ears. Lessons of rhythm, timing, patience. Lessons of silence and timing and courage. These were the educations that made a child useful, and eventually made them an adult. Chapter 6: The First Sorrows. Even for the youngest among them, the medieval world held sorrow close. Death walked alongside life, not hidden in hushed hospital rooms but present, raw, ordinary, and unromantic. A child did not grow up sheltered from grief. They were born into it, surrounded by it. They saw it in the pale lips of a baby sibling who would not wake. They saw it in the lines on their mother's face after a hard winter. They heard it in the toll of the church bell, the way it called out across the fields with that long, low voice that meant someone was gone. Illness was constant, sudden, and often fatal. A scratch could fester. A cough could linger too long. Fever, flux, pox, rot. The names were simple, brutal, and often unstoppable. And so, children learned young that people could vanish from life with little warning and no reason. They might cry, but only briefly. Life did not pause for mourning. There was wood to chop, flour to grind, animals to feed. Grief was folded into routine. They wore it, but they did not indulge it. Funerals were not grand affairs. A body wrapped in cloth, a simple blessing, a grave dug by those who had the strength. Sometimes, in the deepest part of winter, the ground itself was too hard, and the dead were kept in sheds or caves until the thaw. A child might be asked to help dig, to carry a lantern, or fetch shovels. No one told them they were too young, because no one was too young. Sorrow was a part of the growing. And yet, for all this proximity to death, or perhaps because of it, children clung fiercely to the living. Bonds between siblings were tight, almost sacred. There was no guarantee that anyone would survive the next illness, the next storm, the next failed harvest. So they held one another closely. They shared blankets, stories, secret places in the woods. They knew each other's footsteps, each other's coughs, the creak of the bed when someone woke in the night. When a sibling died, something went quiet in the house, not just because of grief, but because a part of the daily pattern had vanished. A chair no longer used. A cup left untouched. The routines themselves mourned. Parents wept, though not always where children could see. Grief was often private, swallowed and buried alongside the dead. And yet, children noticed. They felt the change in the air, the way the song stopped for a while, the way laughter seemed to step outside and wait at the door. And still, they carried on. Because they had to. Because sorrow was a familiar visitor, not welcome, never wanted, but always expected. The first sorrows of a medieval child were not softened. They were real, sharp, and often unspoken. And yet those sorrows shaped them, made them quieter, perhaps, but also stronger, resilient not in some heroic sense, but in the way of stone, worn, solid, enduring. So as you drift now, dear listener, into the softness of your own room, remember those small hearts who learned early how to grieve without breaking, who learned that life, even when short, was still precious, that love, even when brief, was still worth giving. That childhood, even in a hard world, still carried light. Let's keep walking. There are more years yet to grow. Chores, sweat, and the rhythm of the day. The sun in the medieval sky did not rise for leisure. It rose for labor, and so did the children. A medieval day began not with a slow stretch or quiet breakfast, but with motion, fast, purposeful, necessary. For a child, the morning light meant it was time to work, and that meant a dozen tasks before a bite was ever taken. Boys might be sent to the well to draw water, hands red with chill by the time they returned. Girls swept the floor, scattered grain for the hens, and stoked the fire from embers saved overnight. If the family had animals, the children were already outside before the dew lifted, brushing the mule, checking the fences, gathering eggs warm from the nest. There was no debate, no defiance. Chores were the day's first breath, and the world did not pause to accommodate tired eyes or dragging feet. The rhythm of life was set by the sun, the season, the needs of the farm or household. Summer brought long days of planting, weeding, and eventually harvesting. Winter meant chopping firewood, tending animals more closely, mending clothes, and preserving food. Each job had its place in the song of survival, and children learned the tune young. At first, they were small players, gathering kindling, holding the bowl steady while dough was kneaded. But soon, they were full participants. A child of 7 might be expected to manage tasks on their own. At 10, they could be trusted with knives, axes, fire. Each job carried risk, but also pride. A boy who split a log clean was praised with a nod. A girl who could pluck a goose and gut it without flinching earned quiet approval. These were not skills taught for entertainment. They were needed. Everyone's labor mattered. And the line between child and adult, in many ways, blurred quickly. By the time a child reached 12 or 13, they were often working full days, indistinguishable from their parents in the field or kitchen or workshop. And yet, there was more than just drudgery. There was rhythm. The days had a kind of music. The scrape of a hoe in the soil, the creak of the barn door, the rhythmic thud of grain being pounded into flour. Children worked, yes, but they also belonged. There was satisfaction in a job done well, in a chicken coop kept clean, in firewood stacked high before the frost came. Some children found joy in the patterns, the same way a gardener finds peace in turning earth, or a baker in kneading dough. And the family noticed. Work was the measure of value, and children who contributed were seen and, in their own way, honored. They earned scraps from the table, kind words, sometimes even a coin or trinket if they performed well. Their labor wove them into the fabric of the family, the village, the season, and while exhaustion was common, limbs heavy, backs sore, it was accepted. Not as something cruel, but as something true. Rest came later, in snatches, in stolen minutes before dusk, or around the hearth after supper. Then, for a little while, the work stopped. The chores were done, and the child who had been gathering turnips or stirring porridge became again just a child, tired, quiet, warm. If they were lucky, there might be a story. A tale from the old days, told by a grandparent, or a fable whispered while socks were mended. In these brief moments, softness returned. Heads nodded. Eyelids grew heavy. Tomorrow would come with its own list of chores. But for now, there was peace, apprenticeships, trade, and the path to purpose. Not all children stayed in the home. Some, as they grew, were sent away, not out of cruelty, but tradition, to serve, to learn, to become. For many boys, and a few girls, this meant apprenticeship, a path not just to a skill, but to a place in the world. By the age of 7 or 9, or sometimes as late as 12, a child might leave their family home to live under the roof of a master craftsman, a blacksmith, weaver, cooper, mason, baker. There, they would spend the next 7 years or more, not only learning the trade, but living it. They were fed, clothed, disciplined, and trained. In many ways, they became a part of a new family. But this new family was less forgiving than the one they had left behind. Apprentices rose early. They swept the floor, tended the fire, ran errands, watched. In time, they were allowed to practice, to work the bellows, stir the dye pots, hammer nails, bake loaves. They learned not only the skill itself, but the rhythms of business, the tools, the customs. A blacksmith's apprentice, for instance, learned to recognize the color of hot iron, to shape it swiftly, to anticipate the master's need for water or coal. A weaver's apprentice learned to tie threads with speed, to fix a jammed shuttle, to stretch linen smooth. The work was long, and mistakes were punished. A botched batch of bread or a cracked horseshoe might bring a cuff to the ear, or worse. But success earned respect. By the end of their apprenticeship, a young man or woman was expected to know the trade as well as their master. Some even went on to become journeymen, wandering from town to town, offering their services, saving coin, hoping one day to set up shop on their own. For girls, the path was often domestic service. A young girl of 10 or 11 might be sent to live in a wealthier household, working as a maid, cook's helper, or nursemaid. She scrubbed floors, fetched water, helped dress her mistress, soothed crying infants. It was hard, often thankless work, but it was work, and for some, it opened doors. A sharp, dependable servant might earn favor, even a place in a noble household, and the skills she gained, sewing, cooking, cleaning, would make her a valuable wife one day, or at least a respected member of her village. For all children, apprenticeships were a kind of transformation. They marked the shift from dependent to contributor. The family might visit now and then, but the child no longer truly belonged at home. They were becoming someone new, and it was lonely. The first nights were often hardest, sleeping under a strange roof, eating someone else's food, answering to unfamiliar rules. But slowly, they adjusted. They made friends. They found pride in small things. A perfect stitch, a clean floor, a well-balanced wheel. And somewhere in the midst of the repetition and roughness, they grew. Not just taller, wiser, tougher, skilled. By the time the apprenticeship ended, the child was gone, and in their place stood something more solid, more certain. A weaver, a smith, a baker, a woman who could run a kitchen, a man who could run a forge. And so childhood ended not with a party or celebration, but with a quiet shift. The moment when a child was no longer learning, but doing. When they stood not behind, but beside. When their hands were no longer new, Sleep now, dear listener, for even the most diligent apprentice must rest. We'll follow them further tomorrow as they learn how to love, how to sin, how to hope. There is still so much more to uncover in this long, quiet journey through medieval childhood. Love, affection, and the quiet bonds of family. Though the medieval world could be harsh and its children burdened early with work, it would be wrong to imagine it without love. Love did not always look the way we picture it now. There were no birthday parties, no handwritten notes tucked into lunch pails, no framed school portraits on a wall. But it was there, woven into the daily acts of survival, folded into gesture, tone, presence. In a world where time was scarce and tenderness had no luxury of performance, affection took quieter forms. A mother might press a crust of bread into a child's hand while whispering a reminder to eat slowly. A father might rest his calloused palm on his son's shoulder without a word. The weight of it, a kind of silent pride. These were not loud declarations, but they were real, and the children felt them. They learned to look for care in the way their cloaks were patched, in the way someone sat beside them at the fire without speaking, in the way a sibling gave up their seat closest to the heat on a freezing night. That was love. It did not speak. It did. Hugs and kisses were not always common in the peasant home, not because love was absent, but because work did not pause. Life pressed on. The fire needed feeding, the animals needed tending, and there were no pauses for sentimentality. But a lullaby murmured through cracked lips as a child drifted into sleep, a rough hand brushing straw from their hair. A glance exchanged across a crowded table when laughter rang out. These too were affection. Parents loved their children fiercely, sometimes so fiercely that their love looked like fear, like silence, like sternness. To scold a child was to protect them. To punish was to prepare. A child raised too softly might not survive the world. And so, love became instruction, became order, became expectation. But beneath the surface, always, was care. Children, for their part, loved you back. They fetched water for their mothers without being asked. They watched their fathers split wood with admiration that turned into imitation. They cuddled younger siblings and sat close to grandparents, listening to the same stories again and again, never quite tired of them. In the evenings, the family gathered near the fire, not for entertainment, but for warmth and company. And in that stillness, in the lull between labor and sleep, love revealed itself. Not through grand displays, but in presence, in proximity, in patience. Even in noble homes, where children were sometimes sent away to be fostered, affection endured. Letters were sent between households, gifts exchanged, tokens, a ring, a scarf, a ribbon, held tightly until the families reunited, if they ever did. Love, like everything in the medieval world, was shaped by necessity. It did not speak in flourishes, but it endured. It whispered through generations. And even in a life of hardship, it gave children a reason to return home, to lean into a hug, to sing an old song softly to their own children, years later, when the fire burned low. Rules, punishments, and the shaping of obedience. To raise a child in the Middle Ages was not simply to feed and clothe them. but to mold them into something good, something obedient, something useful. And so, alongside the games and the work and the whispered lullabies, came the rules. There were rules for how to sit, how to speak, how to behave in church. There were rules for how to treat elders, how to eat, how to dress. Children were expected to learn quickly and to remember. To forget was not just childish, it was dangerous. A single misstep could insult a guest, offend the priest, damage the family's standing. And so obedience was taught early and reinforced often. Punishment was not hidden behind closed doors, nor delayed with long discussions. It was swift. It was expected. A switch from the tree, a leather strap across the palm, a firm grip on the shoulder. These were common, accepted, and not usually done with cruelty, but with the same seriousness one might use to mend a broken cart or seal a leaking roof. A child needed shaping, and punishment was the tool. In some homes, especially among the clergy or in wealthier houses, discipline came with ritual. Boys in monastic schools might be struck across the knuckles for mispronouncing a Latin verse. Girls learning embroidery might have their work unpicked by a stern mistress for even the smallest mistake. Shame was often used, a disapproving glance, a few public words of correction. But more than pain or humiliation, it was disappointment that cut deepest. A child craved approval, and to be told they had failed, even in a whisper, could weigh heavier than the switch. Yet even discipline had limits. Most parents knew the line between correction and cruelty, and children, despite the punishments, were not afraid to love those who disciplined them. The same father who raised his voice might also be the one who carried a child through the rain. The same mother who scolded harshly might hum softly over a bowl of soup as the child warmed beside the fire. Discipline was a way to prepare, to survive, to bring up a child who would not speak out of turn to a lord, who would not wander into the woods alone, who would not ruin precious flower by being careless. The world had no cushion, and so parents became the first edge, sharp but needed. There were darker punishments too. In some towns, schools employed harsh physical beatings. Public shaming of children was not uncommon. In orphanages or almshouses, where care was thin and discipline absolute, children sometimes bore the full force of neglect and abuse. Not all who disciplined did so with love. Not all survived the shaping. And yet, in most homes, especially those built on shared struggle, the rules were less about power and more about protection. A child taught to listen lived longer. A child who learned silence might avoid a stranger's wrath. And so, obedience was not about submission, but about survival. And as they grew, children who once feared the rod came to understand its purpose. Not all agreed with it. Some carried the memory of a belt for the rest of their lives, but others remembered only the voice behind it, tired, worn, afraid for their safety. For love wears many faces, and in the medieval world, one of them looked like discipline. Now, dear listener, the fire has burned low again. Another chapter in this quiet journey has passed. Sleep, if it calls you. The children of the Middle Ages still have more to show us, more paths to walk, more lessons to share, more years to grow. Let's continue together when the night is quiet and the heart is open. We are only halfway through religion, prayer, and the child's soul. In the medieval world, religion was not a quiet presence in the background. It was the air everyone breathed, the water they drank, the rhythm by which each moment of life was measured. And for children, this began from the very start. Long before a child could speak in full sentences, they were introduced to the signs and sounds of the sacred. A cross hung above the bed, a whispered prayer before sleep, the scent of incense at Mass, heavy and ancient. Religion was not a choice. It was a certainty. Children learned their faith not through questioning, but through repetition, observation, and the gentle insistence of every adult around them. The first thing many children memorized, even before their own name in some cases, was a prayer. Latin words whose meaning they may not yet have grasped, but whose rhythm they knew, like the beating of a drum. Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, whispered before meals, after confession, before stepping out into a storm. The Church taught that the soul was fragile, and children, being innocent and impressionable, were believed to hover closer to the divine, yet dangerously vulnerable to sin. And so, the work of salvation began early. Boys and girls were brought to Mass, stood beside their families in chill stone chapels as the priest chanted and the candles flickered. They watched the elevation of the host with wide eyes, not fully understanding, but deeply aware that something solemn, something holy, was unfolding before them. Catechism was taught by village priests, or, in some towns, by friars and monks. Children learned the commandments, the lives of the saints, and the punishments for sin, which ranged from the mundane to the terrifying. Hell was not a vague concept. It was described in detail, with fire and torment and the eternal cries of the damned. And though some children may not have understood every theological nuance, they understood enough. Be good, be obedient, be faithful, or suffer. Confession, too, came early. A child of 7 might kneel behind the screen, heart pounding, voice trembling as they admitted to stealing a turnip, lying about their chores, hitting a sibling. The priest would listen, unseen, and then offer penance. A few prayers, perhaps, or a firm reminder to honor their parents. And with that, the child left lighter, forgiven, watched. Yet religion was not only fear, it was comfort. It gave shape to suffering. It offered explanations for the unexplainable. Why a baby died, why the harvest failed, why the stars wheeled overhead in their silent patterns. Children turned to saints as companions. Saint Nicholas, protector of children. Saint Margaret, guardian of childbirth. Saint George, slayer of dragons and patron of courage. Their stories were told like fairy tales, only holier. Holy days brought relief from routine. Feasts, festivals, candlelit processions. A child might carry a small taper in a solemn line through the village, heart swelling with something nameless as bells rang out and voices rose in song. The church was everywhere, in the layout of the calendar, in the shape of the village, in the fabric of the family, in a child who wandered too far, who broke the rules, who seemed unruly or unblessed. Well, prayers would be said for them, candles lit, intercessions offered, because even in all its sternness, medieval faith held a deep tenderness for children. They were seen as vessels of both promise and peril, capable of great sin, yet also the most likely to see heaven. Their souls were precious, their prayers powerful, and so they were guided with care, watched closely, disciplined not only for their behavior, but for their eternity. So tonight, if you hear the faint echo of bells in your dreams, or feel the chill hush of a chapel passing through your thoughts, think of the children who stood beneath those high stone arches long ago, who knelt with muddy knees and whispered prayers with trembling lips, who tried, in their own small way, to be good, and were loved, not just by family, but by a world that saw the sacred in them, friendships, bonds, and childhood kinship. Even in a life marked by labor and rules, children found each other. Perhaps especially because of those hardships, the friendships of medieval childhood ran deep. There were no organized playdates, no schoolyards filled with supervised laughter, but children met in the fields, at the well, along the dusty paths between houses. And when they met, they formed bonds that might last a lifetime. A shared loaf of bread, a secret hiding place behind the hayloft, a song sung in rhythm while spinning wool. These were the threads that bound one child to another. They didn't need much. In fact, they needed almost nothing at all. Just time and presence and the simple joy of not being alone. Often, the first friendships were formed among siblings. In crowded cottages with few divisions, brothers and sisters were companions, co-conspirators, caretakers. An older child might carry a younger one on their back during chores, or share their blanket when the frost pressed close against the walls. Even in squabbles, affection was rarely lost. Because in a world where death came early and often, siblings were a constant, and sometimes the only true peers a child had. Outside the home, village friendships formed around shared tasks. Girls stitched together, gossiped quietly over baskets of laundry. Boys ran beside the plow or hunted birds with slings made from string and stone. Together, they learned how to laugh without drawing scolds, how to sneak an apple from the tree without leaving a mark, how to build little forts from sticks and dreams in the woods. There were rivalries, of course, petty jealousies, scrapes and bruises and shouted words. But they passed quickly. There was little time to hold grudges. The very next day, the same hands would be needed to lift a heavy pail or help reach a high branch. And so forgiveness became part of the rhythm too. In some cases, friendships even crossed class lines. A lord's child might sneak away to play with a stable boy. A kitchen maid might teach a merchant's daughter a game or a song. These moments were rare and not always approved, but they happened, especially among the very young, who had not yet learned to see the world's strict lines. As children aged, these bonds sometimes faded, shaped by marriage, trade, or the simple drift of time. But in quiet moments, the memories remained. The day they danced in the rain instead of gathering herbs. The afternoon, they stole honeycomb from the hives and ran, breathless and laughing, down the hill. Friendship was not recorded in ledgers. It left no trace in parish rolls or tax logs, but it lived quietly, warmly, in the space between childhood and the world's demands. And sometimes, when the fields were silent and the sky hung low and gray, an old man or woman might pause, mid-task, and think suddenly of a face they had not seen in 60 years. A friend long gone, but not forgotten. So as your own thoughts begin to quiet, imagine them. The two boys sitting by the river, feet dangling in the current. The two girls braiding each other's hair with flowers, giggling at some whispered joke. No record of them remains, but they were real, just as you are, just as your friendships have been. Rest now, and let their laughter echo gently through your dreams. We'll continue soon. There are still more seasons to pass through, more lessons to uncover in the quiet, resilient lives of medieval children, the village child, and the noble heir. In the great and tangled world of the Middle Ages, not all children walked the same path. While most were born to the rhythm of the village, their feet muddy, their meals humble, their futures known, a smaller number were born into stone walls, candlelight, in the strange quiet of wealth. The noble child, the heir to land and name and power, was raised differently. But they were still children, and they too had to learn. A noble boy might be born into swaddling, finer than most peasants ever touched, silk lined with soft wool, wrapped in a cradle carved by hand. His name would be carefully chosen, perhaps echoing a powerful ancestor or saint. And from the very start, he was not only a son, he was an investment, a future knight, a political tool, a bearer of lineage. He was not coddled, he was groomed. At a young age, usually around 7, noble boys were sent to foster in another noble household, not out of rejection, but tradition. There, they would learn courtly manners, swordplay, hunting, Latin prayers, and the art of diplomacy. They served at table, tended horses, and trained under the watchful eye of older knights. They learned not only how to wield a blade, but how to speak carefully, when to bow, when to stay silent. Girls of noble blood were kept closer to home. Their training was no less important, only quieter. They were taught to read, if the family valued education, and to sew, to sing, to manage a household. A noblewoman might one day oversee hundreds of servants, balance accounts, and serve as the linchpin of her husband's estate. Her education prepared her for this, and also for obedience, piety, and, most critically, marriage. For noble children, marriage was a matter of family strategy. Betrothals were arranged early, sometimes when the children were still in the cradle. A young girl might be promised to a neighboring lord before she could speak, and by the time she was 12 or 13, she could find herself wed, leaving her childhood home for a foreign castle, carrying only a small bundle of belongings and the weight of expectation. Still, there were moments of joy. A noble child might have a pet hound, a falcon, or a tutor who told them stories of far-off lands. They played music, recited poetry, watched tournaments, And sometimes, if the day was free and the weather kind, they slipped away to run in the gardens or climb a tree, just like any other child. Meanwhile, the village child watched them from afar. They heard the stories of the noble family, how the lady had fallen ill, how the heir had returned from training, how the young daughter would soon marry. Their lives overlapped only at a distance. Yet now and then, paths crossed. A peasant boy might be selected to serve as a page. A village girl might be chosen as a handmaid. And in those rare moments, their worlds touched, gently, briefly. But both were raised under the same sky. Both learned their place, their duties, their fears. And both, in their own way, were shaped not only by what they had, but by what they were denied. The noble child lacked freedom, often affection. The village child lacked ease, often safety. And yet both grew, dreamed, endured. Childhood, in all its forms, remained a flickering candle, brief, bright, easily blown out. Festivals, fairs, and childhood delight. Not every day in the medieval world was burdened by labor. The calendar was lined with feast days, saints' days, and holy festivals. Sacred pauses in the grinding cycle of survival. And for children, these moments shimmered like stars in the long dark of obligation. Imagine the village square suddenly transformed. Stalls rise, filled with cloth and pottery, herbs and cheeses. Minstrels tune their instruments. The air smells of roasted meat and fresh bread, of wax and tallow, of spilled cider. Children dart between legs, wide-eyed, sticky-fingered, breathless with excitement. On festival days, they were allowed to be loud, to laugh, to forget, just for a moment, the chores waiting at dawn. They watched acrobats tumble, fools dance, bears lumber on chains. Coins clinked, songs rose, flags snapped in the breeze. It was color in a world often gray. Even the church, usually a place of solemnity and order, turned festive during major celebrations. Candle-lit processions wound through streets. Girls wore wreaths in their hair. Boys carried banners. At Easter, they rang bells and sang hymns. At Christmas, they warmed themselves by the Yule fire and listened to tales of miracles. Children performed too. In plays, retelling biblical scenes. In recitations. In mock tournaments. A boy might don a wooden sword and march beside older youths, dreaming of his future. A girl might sing before the Lord's hall, cheeks flushed, heart pounding. These were moments of glory, small, fleeting, unforgettable. Food, always precious, flowed more freely. Spiced cakes, sugared almonds, meat pies, fruit preserved in honey. For many children, this was the only time they tasted such luxuries, and they savored every bite. They danced in circles to the beat of drums, lit sparklers made from pine resin, and fell asleep under benches while the adults sang on. And then, as all things do, it ended. The stalls were packed, the banners rolled away, the village returned to stillness. But something lingered, a memory, a glow, a secret smile. For the rest of the week, children played at being minstrels and merchants. They repeated the songs, the jokes, the gestures of the juggler who had made them laugh until they wept. Festivals reminded them that the world could be more than toil, that life held music, mystery, color, and even if they woke the next morning to icy floors and aching limbs, something in them was lighter. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine it: the flicker of torchlight on stone, the sound of tambourines in the night air, the taste of sweetened bread on a tongue unused to sugar. For in those moments, however brief, the children of the Middle Ages were not so different from the children of today. They longed for wonder, and sometimes they found it. Let's keep going. The seasons will turn, childhood will fade, but the story still has chapters left to unfold, gently, quietly, as the night deepens around us. The village school and the question of education. In the still hours of the morning, when mist clung low over the thatched rooftops and the sky was the soft gray of worn wool, a bell might ring, faint, distant, barely rising above the sound of roosters and the sleepy rustle of early chores. This was not the bell of a grand cathedral or castle keep, but something humbler, the call of the village school, where a handful of children, cloaks tight against the chill, would make their slow way to a long wooden bench and a stern voice waiting in a cold stone room. Not every child went to school. Most did not. For in the medieval world, education was a rare thing, a narrow privilege, and often considered unnecessary for the life that lay ahead. Why learn to read when your days would be spent sowing barley or weaving wool? Why write your name when your hands were more often covered in soil than ink? And yet, some were sent, not for luxury, but for necessity. Sons of merchants, of minor nobles, of guild craftsmen, boys mostly, who might one day need to keep accounts, sign contracts, read scripture. For them, the path to education began early. School was not always a building in the way we picture it now. Sometimes it was a room off the chapel, dim and drafty, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and wax. Other times, it was the priest's own home, a corner set aside for instruction. A single teacher, often the priest himself, guided the children, voice low, manner severe, face lined not only by age, but by the effort of teaching young minds that wandered easily. There were no desks, only planks laid over trestles. No blackboards, only slate tablets and parchment when it could be spared. The children sat close, knees touching, shoulders hunched, breaths fogging in the winter chill. The first lessons were always the same. Latin prayers, copied endlessly, recited in a half-whisper like spells. Pater Noster, Ave Maria. The alphabet followed, scratched into slates with chalk or bone styluses. They learned to count, to mark time by the church's calendar, to recognize letters not for the joy of reading stories, but for the sake of understanding psalms and commandments. The Bible was not read for comfort. It was memorized for obedience. Books were rare, precious, chained to lecterns or guarded behind monastery walls. If a child ever touched one, it was with awe. The feel of vellum beneath the fingers, the scent of ink and dust, these were not everyday sensations. Discipline in the classroom was firm. Talking out of turn could earn a flick of the cane. Laziness brought sharp words. and worse. The teacher's patience, like his ink, was in short supply. Yet the children still came, even if reluctantly, because education, even in its strictest form, opened a door, however narrow. To be literate was to be noticed. To be capable with numbers was to hold a kind of power. And though few village children ever rose high in society, those who could read were often chosen for better tasks: clerks, scribes, apprentices to notaries. For a peasant boy with a sharp mind, this was perhaps the only way up. Girls, for the most part, were not taught. A noble daughter might learn to read, perhaps to write a few lines, to keep household records, to compose a prayer. But in villages, most girls learned their letters only through songs and scripture heard aloud. Their education was at the hearth: how to spin wool, how to keep accounts in memory, how to manage a home when the men were in the field. And yet, many were clever. Many remembered prayers word for word. Many kept careful track of debts and favors owed in the village. Education, for them, was unspoken, unwritten, but no less sharp. Sometimes schools were attached to monasteries. These were more organized, more rigorous, often reserved for boys destined for the cloth. Here, lessons began before dawn, interrupted only for prayer, meal, and more prayer. They copied manuscripts, learned rhetoric and philosophy, puzzled over grammar until their heads ached. The discipline was absolute, the silence near total, and for the few who succeeded, there lay ahead a life in the church, one of celibacy, service, and often considerable influence. A priest could read, a monk could write, a bishop might shape the law itself, but that path began in the cold chapel schools, where boys sat on benches too high for their legs, ink-stained fingers trembling as they scratched out Latin under the watchful eye of a master who rarely smiled. For those outside the classroom, school was a mystery. They saw the other boys with their slates and cloaks, muttering strange words as they walked home, and wondered what it was like. Some envied it, some pitied it, most simply accepted it as one more difference among many. Because even then, a child understood that the world was divided between those who learned and those who labored, between the pen and the plow. And most knew from the start which path was theirs. But not always. Some children crossed those boundaries. A clever shepherd's son who listened to sermons until he could recite them by heart. A miller's daughter who quietly learned to write letters from an aging priest. In hidden corners of the world, education passed hand to hand like a smuggled loaf of bread, precious, fleeting, nourishing. And so, as you drift now into the folds of sleep, imagine them. The boys bent over their slates, lips moving as they sound out strange syllables. The girls humming memorized verses while spinning wool. The old priest muttering to himself as he prepares tomorrow's lesson. The scratching of chalk, the rustle of parchment, the dim glow of a single candle, burning low over a prayer half remembered. School was not easy. It was not kind. But it was a door, narrow, heavy, slow to open. And for those few children who passed through it, the world grew just a little wider. Now rest, dear listener. Another lesson comes with the dawn, and the children of the past are still waiting to be seen. We'll return soon. There's much more to learn. The apprentice child, a life traded for a future. The day came not with celebration, but with a quiet sort of finality. No trumpet, no farewell feast, only the sound of boots on a dirt path, the weight of a small bundle tied with rough string, and a parent's hand, pressing just once on a thin shoulder before letting go. The child, no older than 10 or 12, would not return home for years. Some never did. They were apprenticed now, their childhood exchanged, piece by piece, for a skill, a trade, a place in the world. To be apprenticed in the medieval world was to be reshaped, from play into purpose, from freedom into form. Most often, it was boys who left, sons of peasants, merchants, even minor nobles, were sent to another household, often one of equal or slightly higher standing, to live under a new roof and begin the long journey toward mastery. The choice of trade depended on the family's connections, the child's promise, and the thin opportunities available. A father might plead with a cousin who owned a tannery. A mother might call on an old midwife to take her daughter into service. Every arrangement was a gamble, on the child's resilience, on the master's fairness, on the future itself. For those taken in, the change was immediate. Gone were the familiar rhythms of home, the comforts of known voices and warm corners. The new house, whether it was a blacksmith's forge, a baker's kitchen, or a tailor's crowded shop, was a world of rules and expectations. The master, once a distant figure, now controlled nearly every aspect of the child's life. When they rose, what they ate, how they spoke, what they touched, when they slept, all was regulated. Discipline was constant, correction swift, praise rare. The first year was the hardest. Known as the year of watching, it was a time of relentless observation. The apprentice did not yet work the forge or the loom, but fetched water, swept floors, stoked fires, watched tools being sharpened, and hands moving with frightening speed. They listened, memorized, mimicked. Mistakes brought cuffs or barked rebukes. A broken pot might cost a meal. A spilled sack of flour might bring a night without a blanket. Apprentices learned to be silent, efficient, invisible until needed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they changed. The blacksmith's apprentice began to recognize metal by its color, the hiss it gave when cooled, the way the hammer must fall. The potter's boy learned the rhythm of the wheel, the difference between soft and too soft. The girl in the brewer's cellar knew the smell of spoiled barley before her master did. Their bodies grew into the work. Their minds adjusted to the long hours, the repetition, the quiet pride of doing something just a little better than yesterday. The length of an apprenticeship varied, but 7 years was common. 7 years of sweat and correction, of learning not just skill, but patience, humility, endurance. And at the end, if they endured, they emerged not children, but tradespeople, a weaver, a cobbler, a carpenter, a brewer. Sometimes they remained with their master as paid journeymen. Sometimes they wandered, literally, as journeymen, meaning day workers, offering their skill where it was needed, hoping to save enough to one day open a shop of their own. And for the fortunate few, that happened. A boy who once swept ashes might end up owning the forge. A girl who once mopped ale from stone floors might marry into the merchant class. Trade brought freedom. Not always, not for all, but enough to matter, enough to keep the dream alive. But apprentices were still children, especially at the start. They missed home, missed warmth, familiarity, the songs their mothers sang while carding wool. They cried sometimes, though not where anyone could see. They clung to kindness when it came. A gentle word from a journeyman, a crust of bread shared by the kitchen maid, a master who taught with patience instead of anger. Bonds formed in those small spaces, between apprentices especially. Boys and girls bound by circumstance, whispering in shared sleeping quarters, trading tips, warning each other about moods and expectations. They became each other's refuge, the only ones who understood the weight of the work, the fear of failure, the ache of being far too young in a world that had little time for softness. Some masters were cruel. There are records of apprentices beaten, neglected, worked beyond breaking. Some ran away, taking their chances on the road, hoping for a kinder fate. Others were bound by contracts, by oaths, by fear. Some stayed, bore it, and came out the other side with bitterness or resolve. But many were simply firm. Not cruel, not kind, just strict, consistent. They taught well, they expected much, and when the apprentice succeeded, they were proud. They nodded, they said little, but they noticed. In cities and towns, guilds oversaw many of these apprenticeships. Guilds protected their trades, set prices, standards, rules. They ensured that no one could practice the craft without proper training. And in some cases, they offered a degree of protection to apprentices. A boy mistreated might appeal to the guild, not always with success, but the structure mattered. It gave shape to the journey. Girls, though less often apprenticed, still entered service in large numbers. A girl sent to a clothier or to serve in a noble household learned more than needlework. She learned how to navigate hierarchy, how to manage a staff, how to read the mood of a mistress before a word was spoken. Her future depended on subtlety, on composure. She might one day marry well, or become a respected housekeeper, or run her own boarding house. For all apprentices, the work was grueling. But it was also a thread of possibility, a narrow road out of hunger, anonymity, the fields. And for those who walked it to the end, there was pride, a name known for good work, a skill that fed a family, a place in the world that no one could take. So, as you rest now, dear listener, imagine them. The boy asleep beside the forge, the girl stitching in firelight, the long silence of the workshop broken only by the scrape of tools and the sound of steady breath. Childhood passed behind them like mist. What lay ahead was uncertain, but for tonight, they had done their work, and tomorrow they would rise again, a little stronger, a little wiser, still learning, still enduring. We'll continue soon. The journey is not over yet. Growing up too fast, the end of childhood. There comes a day, and no one ever knows exactly when it arrives, when a child simply isn't a child anymore. There is no ceremony, no candlelit procession, no whispered blessing. Just a moment that passes, unnoticed even by the child themselves, in which their hands stop being small. Their voice steadies, their eyes take on something older, something that cannot be given back. In the medieval world, this change came quickly. A child who once chased chickens through the yard or carved toys from scraps of wood might, within a handful of seasons, be tilling the land beside their father or carrying a newborn of their own. Childhood did not end with time. It ended with necessity. In the eyes of the community, this transition often began around the age of 12. That was the age of responsibility, of confession, of accountability in both faith and life. A 12-year-old could be married, could be punished for crimes as an adult, could swear oaths, enter service, join a guild. They were not asked if they felt ready. They were expected to be. And so, ready or not, they became something new. For some, this meant engagement. Noble children especially were often betrothed by 12 or 13. A girl might find herself preparing to move into the household of her future husband, to be observed, shaped, and guarded until she was old enough to bear heirs. A boy might be sent abroad to serve a lord whose favor could shape his future. These young people smiled when spoken to, bowed when expected, and learned quickly the art of saying much by saying little. For peasant children, the shift was less symbolic and more immediate. A boy of 13 might rise before dawn to follow the plow. He would carry a man's burden, speak with a man's voice, and perhaps be paid for his labor, if only in food, shelter, or trust. A girl of the same age might oversee a household if her mother was ill or gone. She might bake the bread, nurse a sibling, harvest herbs, repair clothes. She might be wed, legally, if not yet physically, to someone twice her age. These were not the exceptions. These were the rules. And yet, within these moments, there remained something soft. A flicker of youth that had not yet gone out. The young man who crouched behind the stable to carve a piece of driftwood into a toy sword he'd never admit was for himself. The young woman who still sang childhood songs while hanging the washing to dry. In private moments, when the world wasn't looking, pieces of their childhood remained, folded carefully beneath their new roles, like a hidden lining sewn into rough wool. The church reinforced the structure of this transition. By 7, a child was said to possess the age of reason. They could sin. They could confess. At 12 or 14, they were spiritually and often legally adult. The sacrament of confirmation marked this change in some areas. And in cities, elaborate festivals were sometimes held, but in rural places, the moment passed like any other day. A whisper, a nod, a new task given without warning. There was no celebration for becoming grown, because to be grown was not something you reached for. It was something placed upon you, and with it came the end of protection. A mistake might no longer be laughed off. A failure might no longer be forgiven. The same hands that once tousled your hair now expected the weight of firewood, the steadiness of a clean harvest, the maturity to be silent in the face of hardship. The lessons learned in childhood, obedience, silence, endurance, were now required without delay. And so the young adapted. Some rose quickly, eagerly, hungry for the status of adulthood. Others stumbled, unsure, still craving softness that was no longer given. There was no room for hesitation. And so they watched their elders. They copied. They kept close to those who had already walked the path. Older siblings, mentors, neighbors. They spoke less. They listened more. The village, too, adjusted its view. The boy who once begged sweets from the baker might now be asked to guard the granary. The girl who played by the well might now serve ale at the tavern. Their mistakes were no longer met with gentle correction. They were held accountable, quietly, completely. It was a strange time between when the child still remembered games but could no longer play them, remembered tears but could no longer shed them. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the stars rose high, these not quite children sometimes gathered, not to play, but to talk. They sat on fences, or in haylofts, or by dying fires. They spoke of things they didn't understand, marriage, taxes, death, and things they did, hunger, love, fear. And though they tried to sound older than they were, their voices sometimes cracked, their words sometimes faltered. They were learning still. Parents watched from a distance, proud, worried, grieving in a way they didn't speak aloud. The child they had once held was gone, and in their place stood someone new. Stronger, yes. Useful, yes. But also changed. There was no pause for reflection, no time to mourn the loss of youth. Only the next season, the next frost, the next step in a life that would continue, with or without comfort. In rare moments, there was ceremony. In cities, a guild might present a new journeyman to the community with quiet applause and a small coin. In noble households, a feast might mark the first hunt or the first dance before court. In the countryside, it was often simpler. A mug of ale passed from father to son. A shawl folded over the shoulders of a daughter with a knowing nod. No speeches, just presence. And still, deep down, the child endured. Buried beneath layers of expectation, wrapped in wool and responsibility, the child remained. It emerged in laughter, in dreams, in a sudden desire to run for no reason. In the way a face lit up at the sight of the first snow. Because even the medieval world, with all its hardness, could not completely erase the human need for joy, for wonder, for memory. So now, as you rest in your own quiet space, think of them, the boys and girls who rose before they were ready, who carried burdens too large for their backs, who stopped being children without ever being told. They grew up too fast, and yet, somehow, they endured. Sleep now, dear listener. There is more to come. The path ahead holds love and sorrow, doubt and devotion, legacy and longing. But for tonight, the fire is low, the stars are bright, and the child, though grown, still remembers how to dream, courtship, marriage, and the end of innocence. By the time a medieval child reached the cusp of what we might now call adolescence, their world began to narrow around a new expectation. Not just work, not just obedience, not even mastery of a trade, but union, marriage. Not the romantic culmination of longing we often imagine today, but a contract, an alliance, a decision shaped by land, lineage, and survival. For many, it marked the true end of childhood, the point at which one's name was no longer only spoken in the present tense, but linked to the future, to heirs, to homes, to toil shared beneath one roof until death. And while love might come later, it was rarely the first concern. Courtship, if it could be called that, was not driven by desire. Among peasants, marriage was practical. A daughter might be promised to a neighbor's son as early as 10 or 11. The terms whispered between families over bread and beer. The details were spare. A pig, perhaps, as dowry, shared access to a well, the understanding that her hands would help with the sheep and his with the barley. Feelings were not required, only suitability. If the boy could work and the girl could manage a hearth, that was often enough. Among nobles, the stakes were higher, the arrangements more rigid. Alliances were drawn with parchment and seals. A 10-year-old girl might be sent away to live with her future husband's family, learning their customs, being groomed into the role she would soon play. A lord might look at a potential bride not with affection, but calculation. What lands came with her name? What claim could her blood make? Her own thoughts were rarely requested. A nod, a courtesy, a vow given before witnesses, and the matter was sealed. And yet, within this structure, the heart sometimes stirred. A glance between two workers harvesting rye, a stolen conversation behind the bakehouse, the soft trading of a ribbon or carved token. These quiet gestures, unacknowledged and unrecorded, were perhaps the only luxuries allowed to the young. The world would not wait for them to fall in love, but some did, quietly, fiercely, in spite of the rules. Some married for love and lived in hardship. Some married without love and made peace. Some never found either, and bore their lives with the same endurance they brought to every other part of existence. Ceremony varied. In villages, a wedding might consist of a blessing at the church door, witnessed by friends and followed by ale and song in a common room. The bride might wear her best dress, not white, not new, just clean. The groom might offer a belt or knife as a token. There would be food if harvest had been kind, dancing if spirits allowed. And then the new couple would walk together to the home where their adult life began. In noble courts, weddings were more elaborate. Days of feasting, minstrels, gifts exchanged between powerful families. The bride might be adorned with gold, with intricate veils and foreign silks, her face painted with solemnity, her heart wrapped in ceremony. She would be expected to bear children, to manage the household, to defend her husband's interests with grace. She might be 13. He might be twice her age. No one questioned it. That was the way of things. What was shared between all classes, though, was the weight of it. Marriage was final. Divorce, rare and complicated, required church approval. A woman was expected to obey her husband, to work beside him, to bear his children and bury them if need be. A man was expected to provide, to protect, to lead. Adulthood was not a goal to pursue, but a role to fulfill. And once you stepped into it, there was no going back. Children followed quickly. A girl who had helped birth her siblings now found herself in labor, gritting her teeth on the same straw-strewn floor where her mother once lay. A boy who had learned to fix a broken yoke, now built a cradle from leftover wood. They were young, often terrified, but life did not wait. It moved forward, unblinking, relentless. There was affection, often, sometimes even tenderness. A wife might bring her husband warm broth at the end of a long day, setting it down without words. A husband might carve a spoon for his wife, careful and quiet in his labor. They might sit together by the hearth, not speaking, but sharing silence like a blanket. These were the moments that stitched love into the fabric of obligation. Soft, hidden, but no less real. For those who never married, life was different. Some joined the church. Others remained in their parents' homes, helping until age or infirmity took them. Some were servants forever, or took lovers in secret. The world had little patience for those who didn't follow its structure, yet some carved out peace on the margins. A widow who kept her own garden, a man who sang alone by the river, his voice never raised in anger. Their lives were not stories, but they were still lives, still human, still felt. Among children who witnessed these unions, lessons were learned. A girl watched her mother's swollen belly and understood her future would be filled with the same pain. A boy saw the lines in his father's hands deepen each year and knew that strength was something you gave away, one day at a time. They understood what marriage meant long before they reached it. Not romance, not rescue, responsibility. And so the end of childhood was sealed, not with age, but with this quiet crossing from one hearth to another, from your father's name to your husband's, from your mother's apron to your wife's hands, from running in the fields to tilling them, from sleep filled with dreams to sleep filled with weariness. Tonight, think of them, young and not so young, standing at the threshold of marriage. Some with joy, some with fear, some with nothing at all but the knowledge that this was what came next, that the path was worn and wide and waiting. Sleep gently now. You have walked far alongside them, and there are still many miles ahead in the quiet, unmarked journey that was childhood in the Middle Ages. We'll continue soon. There are still whispers to follow, and soft truths waiting in the dust. Discipline within the home, chores, correction, and consequences. As the long shadow of childhood faded into the demanding shape of adulthood, the discipline that had guided medieval children from their earliest years did not vanish. It only changed its tone. Correction did not stop at the church door or the end of a school bench. Within the home, discipline was as constant as the hearth fire and nearly as necessary. It shaped the rhythm of the household, reinforced the hierarchy within it, and taught children the expectations of obedience, labor, and humility, not as abstract values, but as lived and repeated truths. The home, whether a peasant's one-room cottage or a merchant's crowded townhouse, was not merely a place of rest. It was a workplace, a classroom, a chapel, and sometimes a courtroom. In such spaces, discipline was not an event. It was a language, and children, from the moment they could understand words, learned its dialect. Chores were a child's first and constant responsibility. Before a child could read or write, they were often expected to contribute something: fetching water, gathering kindling, sweeping the floor with a bundle of dried rushes. These tasks were small, but foundational. To complete them well meant being noticed. To forget them, or worse, to refuse, invited correction. Sometimes a stern word, sometimes a smack with an open hand or wooden spoon. The reaction was rarely dramatic, but always swift. In a world where each person's labor ensured survival, failure to do your part was not only selfish, it was dangerous. Punishments were not always physical. Sometimes a child was made to stand in the corner or sit by the door with nothing to do. They might be denied their evening bread or made to work longer hours the next day. In rare cases, especially if a child lied or showed defiance, they might be punished in front of the family, their shame becoming a warning to others. A harsh word could carry as much weight as a beating, and children learned quickly to read tone, to sense displeasure before it was spoken. In many households, a particular switch, a bundle of thin branches, was kept above the hearth or behind the door. Its presence was warning enough. It was not always used, but it did not need to be. Children understood the boundaries it symbolized. And while modern minds may recoil at such methods, in their time, they were seen not as cruelty, but as care. A parent who did not correct their child was seen as negligent, even dangerous. Discipline was part of love. Sternness was a form of protection. Fathers often carried the heaviest hand, but mothers administered correction just as frequently and often more subtly. A snapped instruction while kneading dough, a sudden withdrawal of comfort after a misdeed, a silence at the table that could make a child shrink into themselves. Discipline was not always loud. Sometimes it was cold. Sometimes it was just absence. But it was not without compassion. After a punishment, there was often a gesture, a hunk of bread, a blanket pulled over tired shoulders, a hand on the head as the fire burned low. Forgiveness came not as an apology, but as a return to normalcy. The child was fed again, spoken to again, expected again. Discipline was a moment. Belonging was the constant. And not all correction was harsh. Some parents guided with humor, with teasing, with riddles and patience. A father might feign offense at a misstep and then break into laughter. A mother might scold with a smile, reminding her child of their better nature. Many households practiced a discipline that was firm but kind, not indulgent but not unfeeling. Love was the motive, even when its expression was stern. The church supported this structure. Sermons often quoted Proverbs, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Priests encouraged parents to guide their children firmly, reminding them that eternal souls were shaped in the home. Obedience was not only for the sake of parents, but for God. Disrespect was more than misbehavior. It was sin. And so correction became spiritual, not just practical. A child who lied was not only shamed. They were led to confession, kneeling beside the family at Sunday Mass, whispering repentance. Brothers and sisters sometimes disciplined each other. An older sibling left in charge might scold or strike a younger one, acting with the borrowed authority of a parent. These moments were messy, sometimes unjust, sometimes deeply tender. A child might protect a younger brother from punishment by taking blame. A sister might fix a mistake quietly so her sibling would not be beaten. Within the hierarchy of the family, there were quiet acts of mercy and quiet betrayals too. Every home was different. Some households were ruled with iron, others with compassion. Many lay somewhere in between, a daily dance of raised voices and shared bread, of swift correction and soft forgiveness. And over time, children came to understand their place within it. They knew which lines could not be crossed, which mistakes would be punished lightly, and which would be remembered. But discipline was not simply about obedience. It was about forming character, about teaching a child how to walk through the world without causing harm or inviting it. In a society where a loose tongue could spark conflict, where a careless act could cost a season's harvest, restraint was survival. Discipline, in this sense, was a gift, a painful one, perhaps, but necessary. And most children, as they grew, came to understand it that way. By the time a child became a young adult, 12, 14, 15, the rules were internalized. The voice of correction no longer had to come from a parent. It lived inside them. In the cautious way they phrased a request. In the quiet deference they showed to their elders. In the way they rose at dawn without complaint, already moving toward their chores before the fire had been lit. And when they became parents themselves, they did not need to ask what discipline should look like. They remembered not just the pain, but the meaning, the order it brought, the safety, the love wrapped in difficulty. So, as you lie quietly now, dear listener, think of those long ago homes, small, dim, filled with the sounds of work and whispers. Think of the children who learned, through mistake and correction, how to become the people their families needed. Not perfect, not unscarred, but capable, enduring, forgiven. Let sleep come softly. The fire is low, but the lessons linger. We will return soon to their world, to follow the next steps in the long, quiet shaping of a medieval childhood, the role of fear, monsters, warnings, and the stories that kept children safe. When we speak of discipline, of obedience, of the way medieval children were raised to walk in line with expectation and caution, we must also speak of fear, not just the kind that came from the rod or the rebuke, but a deeper, older kind. The fear shaped by story, by silence, by the things whispered in the dark, just loud enough for little ears to hear. In a world that was rough and full of danger, fear served a purpose. It kept children close. It held them back from rivers, forests, fire. And it was taught not just through rules, but through tales. Imagine a child crouched beside the hearth, the shadows playing long across the packed earth floor. A mother plucks feathers from a chicken, her voice low. She is not looking at the child, but she is speaking. "Don't stray past the old yew tree," she murmurs. "That's where the spirit lives, the one who waits for children who wander too far." The child says nothing, but their hands pause in the flower. They've heard the story before. and they will remember. Across the medieval world, tales of danger were as common as lice and just as hard to ignore. Every region had its monsters. Some were wolves and wild men. Others were creatures of folklore. The bugbear, who crept into rooms where children refused to sleep. The boogeyman, unnamed and formless, but always lurking just outside the edge of firelight. The knucker in the well, who waited for careless feet. Will-o'-the-wisps in the marshes, drawing little ones into the bog with flickers of light that danced just out of reach. Even nature itself had character. The forest was not merely a place of trees. It was alive, watchful. It was said to swallow children who disobeyed. The well was deep and echoing, home to spirits who demanded silence. The wind could carry curses. The night always was a space of possibility, and not always the kind you wished for. Parents used these stories as tools, not to frighten their children senseless, but to protect them in a world where death was never far away. A child warned about the water spirit might stay away from the pond. A child told that a beast eats lazy girls might pick up the broom without delay. There were no fences, no gates, no glowing lights. Fear was the boundary. In religious households, fear took on another shape: hell. Priests spoke of it in slow, heavy words, painting pictures of endless flame and torment that lingered in the minds of the young. A child who lied was told of demons that would drag them by the tongue. A child who disobeyed their parents risked more than a beating. They risked their immortal soul. And so the church and the home worked hand in hand, their warnings woven into bedtime stories and Sunday sermons alike. But not all fear was fire and fang. Sometimes it was simply the fear of disappointment, the tight look on a father's face when his child dropped the bread, the silence in a room after a mother's patience ran out. These moments lingered too, sometimes more than monsters. They taught a child that actions had consequences, even when no switch was raised. Children spoke of their fears in quiet voices. Huddled together beneath threadbare blankets, they whispered of things that moved in the rafters, of old women said to curse livestock, of shadows that stretched too long at night. They believed because belief was safer than doubt. It gave shape to the unknown. And yet, for all its weight, fear was not cruelty, not always. It was a form of teaching. In a time without medicine, without search parties, without the safety nets of modern life, a child had to be cautious. They could not afford innocence, and so fear was passed down like a blanket, tattered but warm, meant to cover what reason could not reach. There was also comfort in knowing that fear had rules. The monster only came if you disobeyed. The spirit only watched those who were cruel. The tales gave structure to a world that otherwise seemed random, indifferent. If you were good, you were safe, or so you hoped. Older children outgrew the worst of it, or pretended to. They teased their younger siblings, made up stories even darker, added to the lore with gleeful shivers. They dared each other to touch the edge of the forest, to walk around the graveyard twice, to whistle after dark. And yet, they still jumped at certain sounds, still crossed themselves before entering unknown places. Because some fears never leave, they only grow quieter. Parents, too, remembered. The same mothers who warned their children of spirits had once been told similar stories. The same fathers who scolded about the bog monsters had once whispered of them beneath the same thatched roofs. The fear was inherited and oddly cherished. A shared language between generations. A bridge of caution wrapped in fable. In some villages, seasonal festivals gave these fears a place to live out loud. Masks were worn to ward off spirits, fires lit to scare away the darkness. Children were taught chants, rituals, small acts of protection. Leave bread for the wandering soul. Hang rosemary in the rafters. Never speak a name 3 times after sundown. These were not games. They were survival disguised as custom. Not all fear came from tales. Some came from real things. Wolves in winter. Raiders from the sea. Hunger in a thin year. But even then, stories helped. They made sense of the senseless. They turned suffering into a lesson. They gave a child something to hold on to when the world tilted. And now, as the room around you grows still, and the hush of night settles deeper into your thoughts, let your mind wander to those flickering, fire-lit homes, where children leaned close to listen, wide-eyed, and parents told stories not to scare, but to guard. Think of the ones who slept with one eye open, who tiptoed past the cupboard because they swore they heard a growl, who obeyed not just out of duty, but out of a deep and ancient knowing that the world is wide and they are small. Fear was part of childhood, not the enemy of it. It gave shape to caution. It stitched itself into the very fabric of survival. And in those long, quiet nights, when the wind creaked through the shutters and the fire whispered low, fear became a kind of lullaby. Rest now, dear listener. The monsters cannot reach you. Not tonight. You are safe and the stories have done their work. We'll return again soon to walk further along the path of these long forgotten children who feared wisely and lived well. A quiet goodbye to the children of the past. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our journey, a slow and gentle walk through a world now faded but never truly gone. The children of the Middle Ages are long returned to dust, their names unrecorded, their laughter forgotten by time. And yet, somehow, they remain. In stories, in customs, in the faint echo of our own memories, where we recall what it felt like to be small in a world built by others. We have followed them from cradle to kitchen, from chores to chapel, from the soft hush of lullabies to the hard weight of discipline. We've watched them grow too fast, love too quietly, and work too long, and yet they lived fully in their time. With dirt under their nails, prayers on their lips, and wonder still behind their eyes. Their childhoods were not padded with comfort. They were rough-hewn, like the wooden toys they played with, like the straw beds they slept on, like the stories that raised them, simple, strange, and true. And yet, there was joy. In games played barefoot through the fields, in whispers shared behind barn doors, in moments of kindness, small, invisible, but lasting. They lived in rooms without privacy, in houses without clocks, under skies untouched by electric light. And somehow they learned all they needed to know from the people around them: how to kneel, how to work, how to stay silent, how to endure. If you've listened closely, you've felt it, not just the past, but the thread it leaves behind. Because in some ways, we are all still raised by these echoes. We still tell children stories to keep them safe. We still hold their hands in fear, still scold them in love, still whisper to them in the dark when they cannot sleep. And so, as you drift now into your own stillness, your own quiet night, let the soft weight of the past settle beside you. Let the voices fade. Let the fire dim. And remember, if only for a moment, the children who came before you. They are not lost. They are only sleeping,